Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. We're just going to give people a couple of minutes to join in, and then we'll kickstart things very shortly. It seems to be a standard Zoom protocol at the moment, which is assume 2 minutes past the hour before we kick off. So we just give it a few more seconds, if that's okay, just to give people a chance to connect. Great. Well, good afternoon or good morning to our US colleagues. My name's Tim Minshall. I'm the Dr. John C. Taylor Professor of Innovation and Head of the Institute for Manufacturing here at the University of Cambridge, and I'm going to be chairing this webinar. Three things to cover first. First, a little bit of housekeeping. So just so you know, you will have seen as we came in, this session's being recorded, but only the speakers and what we at this end are doing, not the actual you as attendees. The agenda is roughly as follows. I'm going to say a few little things to introduce things in a second. Then we hand over to our two speakers who are going to talk for around 35, 40-ish minutes, giving an overview of the results of their research. And then we're going to switch to Q&A and discussion session, taking us through to about 20 minutes past 3 UK time. And then we'll wrap things up for the final 10 minutes and be done by 3:30 UK time. If you'd like to ask any questions, what we ask you to do, please, is to click the button at the bottom of your screen marked Q&A and just type the question in there. And when we get to the Q&A session, we'll then be putting those questions to our guest speakers today. So you can type the question in at any time you like throughout the talk, and we'll be reviewing them all the way through. Secondly, a little bit of context. So this event is being organized by the Institute for Manufacturing's skills theme. It's one of a number of research themes we have here at the moment. Also in collaboration with the Centre for Science, Technology and Innovation Policy, headed up by Dr. Owen O'Sullivan. So this topic is hugely important. This connection between skills and innovation and manufacturing has never been more critical. This was important before COVID struck, but it's now even more so as we emerge from this pandemic and seek to ensure that our economies and society are ever more resilient, more competitive, and more equitable. So we were therefore delighted when we saw this research being done at MIT, as published in a new book from two colleagues at MIT, William Bonvillian and Sanjay Sarma. And Owen very helpfully suggested we reach out to these two guys and say, can you come and share some of your thoughts on this to stimulate a discussion on this topic? And that's what brings us here today. So we've got a great balance of people attending today from academia, from government, and from industry. So we hope we'll have a really useful discussion at the end of this, and this will stimulate a series of further discussions and further activities to actually do something about the important issues raised in this book, which, although in a US context, has huge resonance with what's happening in the UK, Europe, and elsewhere. So thirdly, just a little flavor of the backgrounds of our two very impressive speakers. So I'm not going to read out their CVs, but just to give you a quick overview. So Sanjay Sarma, Vice President for Open Learning at MIT. He's Professor of Mechanical Engineering there as well. Co-founder of the Auto ID Center, which developed many of the technologies underpin the EPC suite of RFID standards, which is something that we were colleagues here at IFM also collaborated in. So it's great to see you here, Sanjay. He's also been very actively involved in the creation of MicroMasters programs credentials, MIT's Integrated Learning Initiative, and this World Education Lab that's a really interesting initiative too. Also sits on the board of edX, familiar to many of us as a great resource for learning around the world. And of course has an outstanding academic track record in his field, particularly around RFID, automation, computational geometry, and many other things too. Well worth a look at his profile. And then William Bonvillian, a lecturer at MIT's Science, Technology and Society Department. He's Senior Director for Special Projects at MIT's Office of Digital Learning. Previously, he was Director of MIT's Washington, DC office. And then before that, a whole load of really interesting and highly relevant things for this talk, which position him so well for commenting on this. Many things, just highlighting a couple here. One is he was part of the team that President Obama commissioned to look at university industry advanced manufacturing partnerships. He was a senior policy advisor in the US Senate. He's delivered evidence to many House of Representatives committees and Parliament elsewhere. He sits on the, in fact, chaired the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences Standing Committee on Science, Engineering and Public Policy. So as you can see from those brief summaries of our two speakers, they are ideally positioned to comment on this critical and very timely issue. So Sanjay, Bill, many thanks for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Well, unmute yourself. Well, thank you very much, Tim. A pleasure to be back at the IFM, as it were. This book evolved out of research, as you said, that we were doing on, the way it worked was I was running open learning and I was looking at all the content we were developing and noticing that a lot of our students were older, and the median age was 27. And I reached out to Bill and I said, Bill, our students are not the typical students we have at MIT. There's clearly a hunger from the workforce. And so Bill and I started this research project by looking at what the needs were of the workforce. And we got funding from the Schmidt Futures Foundation. And at the same time, MIT launched a new initiative called Work of the Future. We joined hands there. Our Schmidt Futures Foundation project resulted in a final report. And this is the book form that you mentioned. The book is called Workforce Education: A New Roadmap. And it came out in February last year. Next slide, Bill. So look, workforce education is something that I think society around the world has confronted in waves going back at least 10 years. Bill will talk more about what's happening today, especially post-pandemic, which makes it even more urgent. Even before the pandemic, we knew that this rate at which jobs were changing exceeded our ability in the educational workforce, the educational system to keep workforce up to date. And for those of you who are engineers, there was a certain cavitation in that flow. And coronavirus, of course, has struck suddenly and had a massive impact. In the US, we're talking about 10 million people unemployed. But what's even scarier is the highest labor non-participation rates in history. Bill? Bill, are you muted?
Yeah.
Okay.
So low-wage job impact is a particular problem in the U.S. That's the sector that's been hit hard in recent years and is particularly hard hit in the coronavirus. And many sectors have been facing damage: in-person retail, restaurants, hospitality, transportation, travel, tourism. You know, these sectors will come back. That will take time, but in the meantime, many of those elements have been hit hard. A lot of companies have gone. Many are going to have to change sectors, and some sectors, like in-person retail, are never going to be the same. So those have been areas where the working class in the United States has obtained a lot of employment. They pay a disproportionate price in economic loss as well as sickness and loss of life. So the pandemic makes starkly clear the consequences of kind of US growing economic inequality. Sanjay?
Thanks, Bill. So after World War II, the US, and actually most countries who were involved in World War II, saw a massive return of soldiers. In the US, 16 million soldiers and sailors came home, and our wartime economy was being dismantled. And so the United States had to figure out how to deal with this sudden influx of talent, but also talent that needed to be shaped. And so the US passed something called the GI Bill to educate these returning soldiers and sailors for a new world to create better jobs. And it actually created, to a large extent, the American middle class. Other countries had similar efforts. Canada had something similar. I don't remember what the UK did, but I'm sure they had something similar. And the question really comes down to, how do we improve workforce education? How do we take this on at the scale that we did after World War II in the United States? Because the size of the problem that we're confronting is similar in scale and actually going to get worse. And COVID has brought it home to us. So Bill is going to talk in the next few slides about the challenges, and then we'll dive into some of our use cases, including manufacturing. And then I'll talk about a couple of case studies as well. Bill?
So, what is this workforce education challenge in the US? We've really got a series of broken chains. So there's disconnects in the US. There's a very big gap between the world of work and the world of learning, of education. They're not connected. Our labor department and our education department, they've got limited workforce focus in each. The labor department focuses on displaced workers, underemployed workers, but misses upskilling the existing incumbent workforce and new entrants. The education department focuses on new entrants, but it doesn't provide workforce education. It's oriented to college education. And so the programs don't match up. And we've got universities and community colleges and workforce education programs that are really very disconnected. We've also got in the US disinvestment and underfunding. Disinvestment in recent decades by both government and employers. We've got a strong system of community colleges in many areas, but they are systematically underfunded. We've got advanced technology education programs at NSF. It's a very small program, an important one, but small. We've got new manufacturing institutes that are starting to embark on workforce education, but those are both modest and underfunded programs. We've got struggling institutions. As I mentioned, the community colleges are underfunded, and they also have very low completion rates. So they're sitting right in this workforce education gap, but they're not at the scale and with the programs that are needed. We've got vocational high schools that were largely dismantled starting back in the 1970s, and we haven't rebuilt that system, which exacerbates the work-learn disconnect. And there's a whole set of broken elements in the system in the US, or lack of a system. We don't really have a labor market information chain in the US. We've got a broken labor market information system, which in turn affects the viability of that whole labor market. We're really missing a whole series of components. We don't really have a system, and lifelong education really is not established here yet. So, and it's not only the coronavirus that's leading us to problems. We've got long-standing job quality problems in the US. We've got, in a country that prided itself on the strength of its middle class and its social mobility, instead, for the last 15 years, we've got increasing inequality, not economic convergence, which is a deep problem for our democracy. An economist colleague of ours at MIT, David Otter, has defined the picture in the US as a barbell. On one bell, we've got a growing upper middle class. Then on the bar, we've got a declining middle class, many of whom are being shifted over to the other bell, which is a growing kind of lower end, lower paid services sector. And technological advances in turn, especially in information technology, are putting many quality jobs out of reach for the workers who didn't get the skills training to cope with those arriving systems. So we looked at workforce education needs in 3 large sectors, and these 3 sectors total about 30% of total US employment. So we're really talking about a huge piece. They're very illuminating for the whole system. Our first case study area really was around manufacturing. And as many in this session know, that had been a very important middle-class pathway in the US, particularly for men without college educations. But median income is down in the US for men without high school diplomas or with high school diplomas and only some college. Those numbers are startling. down respectively 20% and 13%. US manufacturing employment fell by 1/3 in a painful decade, the decade between 2000 and 2010. And we've had this very high labor non-participation rate in the past decade in the US. Coronavirus hit some manufacturing sectors hard, for example, aircraft production, although it now appears that the manufacturing recovery and catch-up may be robust from the latest data that we're seeing. But we're going to need overall more resilient supply chains. There may be the need, based upon what we learned about our fragile supply chains during COVID, the need to undertake reshoring of some capabilities. And flexible manufacturing, which would be a result of that, means new manufacturing technologies, which in turn means new skills for the workforce. Overall, manufacturing has an aging demographic, and many retirees are going to be, many retirements are going to be happening in US manufacturing. We're going to have over 2 million retirements in this coming decade in US manufacturing jobs. That will open up job opportunities. But in turn, as we start to shift to advanced manufacturing, that's going to require higher skills. So we've got both a scale problem in manufacturing workforce education and a skills problem. We're going to need to move to higher skills. Sanjay?
Thanks, Bill. The one industry that, another industry that I think we've all seen during COVID has been the changes in retail. But while we think of online retail as being the real big cataclysm, as they call it, facing retail, one should look at the statistics going back 15 years in the United States. The United States, retail was overbuilt by a factor of 6 compared to any European nation, and 50% more than per capita, square footage per capita than Canada. The 2008 crash led to a sudden change in direction of retail. Rather than upscale, retail went a different route, which is the route of the discount model, the idea of becoming cheaper and cheaper. And the workforce was treated more like automatons than salespeople. The stores were emptied of staff. They became much more about margins and about pumping more stuff through the retail store. Meanwhile, by 2010, of course, online really started taking off. And as online took off, and others like even Walmart started following suit and started to go online and what is called omni-channel, which is, you buy in the store, you have it delivered at home, or you buy online, you pick it up at the store, any channel. So warehousing started taking off. Now, warehousing is first of all, more male profession. The storefront is more female, so that caused a gender shift. And the other thing about warehousing is once warehousing took off, warehousing is actually more amenable to automation, to robotics, than storefront operations. So robotics started taking off. So while warehouse jobs have gone up, that increase isn't likely to continue for very long, because eventually robots will take over more of the warehouse jobs. And if you're curious about it, check out a company called Kiva Robotics, which is actually an MIT company that was acquired by Amazon for, I think, $700 and something million a few years ago. And that essentially, it's quite wonderful and frightening at the same time, automates warehouses. So in the midst of all that, of course, COVID strikes, and COVID forces massive store closings because you pay the rent for the stores, but you don't have foot traffic. And of course, we all went online. So online then went to a whole other level. So when retail comes back, what is the future? And it's limping back in some countries in the United States. Well, is it going to be discount retail where you go to buy stuff, or would you prefer to buy, your toothbrushes online? It is more likely that retail will become high skills. So the idea is a store like an Apple store, where you have Apple aficionados persuading you to buy the latest product and also providing you technical service. And if you want even more advanced information, there's a Genius Bar that you can go to. And what that is a different kind of retail, not the retail worker who's simply an automaton moving inventory, but a retail worker who's an expert, who is passionate about the topic. And Apple is not the only example of that. Sephora, which is a perfume cosmetics company, is another example. Even Starbucks used to be that Starbucks always put the barista first. In fact, Starbucks had an education program for its baristas, so they could get undergraduate degrees because they wanted their baristas to be that kind of person. So retail is also going to be in a position where retraining is going to become important. It's getting more technical, more Bluetooth beacons, more robots, more virtual reality. You need to train first level managers. That's what Zara did. Zara's whole secret to success is the excellence of its managers and the contribution they make to spotting new fashion trends, fast fashion, and beating their competitors like H&M, Cote, Ingles, in terms of providing the latest fashion. It's called fast fashion for a reason. So all this means that retail is going to have to upskill. So here's another case study following manufacturing where upskilling becomes important. Bill?
And our third case study is in healthcare. If in-person retail jobs have been in decline, manufacturing has been stabilizing with the possibility of some growth. Healthcare is a rapidly growing sector in the US. We've got an aging population, higher healthcare demands. And then at the same time, new suites of medical technologies are creating entirely new kind of professional areas. And the result is more jobs with higher skill needs, and therefore new training systems are required. There are barriers to that expansion. The established healthcare professions tend to limit entry. But here's another area where online entry can help significantly. So overall, we've got a gap in the US between high school and undergraduate. Jobs in the US increasingly are tending to go to the college educated, but growing IT is demanding new skills. The result is new higher middle skill jobs will require education beyond high school. And while that barbell picture that we discussed earlier shows an expanding services sector as well as an expanding upper middle class, COVID hit that lower end services sector very high. So the job growth in the US looks like, at least for a significant time, is going to be more towards higher end kinds of higher skilled jobs. We've got a big barrier there. Only 1/3 of Americans over age 25 have 4-year college degrees. So if college is the dividing line for economic success in our economy, not enough people have the requisite credentials to get into it. So we're going to need a new workforce education system and really a new credentialing system to go with it. So where do we need attention? As I said earlier, we've got a weak labor market information system. The workers don't know what skills they need. Educators don't know what skills they need to educate for. Employers, they don't know what skills their potential workers have. We've got real issues on the transition from school to work, in contrast to European systems and the workforce reforms that the UK has been advancing. The US is not very far along on this. Our high school diplomas have been assumed to be the requisite credential for many areas, that they're no longer enough. And yet we ended vocational high schools by and large. The community colleges that can pick up the slack step into this new role. They're underfunded, their completion rates are low. Our colleges and universities are not engaged in workforce preparation. They don't think it's their job. We don't have a transferable skills certification system in most fields. So we don't have the information signaling that's required. And as I mentioned earlier, our education and labor department programs are just not aligned. Sanjay?
So, yeah, thanks, Bill. So MIT has a lot of experience in this. I lead the Office of Open Learning, as I said, where almost 200 people, and over the last 20 years, I've been the head for the last 10 years. We've built out an extensive portfolio of online offerings, OpenCourseware, which was created in 20 years ago, literally 2001. Was launched in 2001. Has reached well over 200 million users. We have 2,000 plus courses online. We created MITx and edX. MITx has reached about 4 million learners. edX has reached 110 million enrollments. edX is a consortium that MIT and Harvard created. So MITx is the content that runs on edX. Harvard runs HarvardX on edX. Berkeley runs BerkeleyX on edX. Thousands of courses. We also introduced new credentials like the MicroMasters, which we created here at MIT. We have more than 1 million enrollees in our MicroMasters. We have 5 MicroMasters, and there are now more than 50 MicroMasters from 25 universities on 4 continents. Next slide, Bill. So as I said, it was this that led Bill and me to start exploring, workforce education and the impact that this new technology could make. The fact of the matter is that we're at the very beginning of a revolution in online education. Of course, online itself is an advancement. Every new medium creates waves of excitement about education. Radio, we thought that would change education. Before radio, with correspondence courses, we thought they would transform education. Video cassettes, but online really has, as you can see from the numbers, made a difference, but it is only the beginning. There are other technologies coming down the pike, and what's happened with online is, with coronavirus, a significant fraction of humanity has been exposed to online education. And I'll talk about, what's good about it, what's bad about it. But I think for a lot of people, the convenience and the accessibility has been a surprise. And it's only going to get better. Virtual reality and augmented reality, we're in the very early days. Actually, that's a bit of I should clarify, augmented reality has been used for almost 80 years. We just don't give it credit. And that's in the aviation industry. It turns out that Japan and Germany and the UK and the US, they could all produce planes. But the US and the UK and the Allies could produce pilots because of an augmented reality education technology called flight simulators, produced by the Link company. There's a British general who once said that when the history of the war is written, we should give as much credit to flight simulators as to our extraordinary pilots. But the point is that it's now coming in in a much more accessible way, through smartphones, through tablets, and so on. Computer gaming and simulation. These are things that some of us use already. They're used in a variety of fields, but that'll become much more common. AI-based education, we're in the early days, but this is the holy grail. If this takes off, it really changes the dynamics of education. And what's happening with natural language processing, with GPT-3, with OpenAI, with all the other stuff that's happening, I think we can see the emergence, we can see the opportunities and the impact. We're just beginning to, I think it's just beginning to become real. And the way it'll manifest itself is through digital tutors. So you can imagine a tutor who gives you advice on, you're studying something, you don't understand something, you ask the tutor sort of walks you through it. Not there yet. I think for early childhood we're there, but the thing about these technologies is once we get a foothold, things go fast, and we're getting that first foothold. Well, MIT and we lead a consortium that involves Harvard and a bunch of other universities in Mexico and Germany and the UK, and in Asia and Canada. We are creating blockchain-based credentials. So the idea here is to democratize the transcript. So if you get a certificate, a MOOC certificate, or you take a bootcamp somewhere, wouldn't it be great if you could display it on your resume and the employee could click on it and they could know that you actually got that certificate? So I haven't found too many killer apps for blockchains. I find it a fascinating technology, but I think we found one in certification. Another one, by the way, is ID, especially for refugees. It's called distributed ID, DID. That's something the World Wide Web Consortium is working on, and we're doing this as well through the World Wide Web Consortium. And then finally, I'll talk about it a little bit more in a couple of slides, but never forget the in-person. There are things you can only do in person: coaching, hands-on stuff. You can't learn welding online, right? Even flight simulators could teach you so much, but then eventually you have to learn in the air with an expert next to you. And to enable that, we have a series of programs called bootcamps, as do others as well. Next slide, Bill. Zoom, we just went through a year of Zoom lectures, and we're in one right now. On the one hand, COVID-19 boosted online education, but it actually didn't show the best of online education because we all went to Zoom. And Zoom lectures, it was heroic, everyone made do, students and teachers and parents and all of us. The problem with Zoom is that it is, in some ways, it has neither the charm of in-person lectures nor the value of true asynchronous pre-recorded videos done online. So it is neither good online nor is it good in person, right? It was the worst of both worlds. Now you could make the argument that our precious in-person time, which we hope to all get back soon, should not be squandered in one-way lectures, which we did squander before COVID, because the research shows that a professor just speaking to the student doesn't mean the student is engaging. And so there is this big move now to flip the classroom, and pre-recorded videos are a very important tool in that. MOOCs, massive open online courses, are based on asynchronous videos. And the beauty of that is you can pause the lecture, you can rewind it. If you didn't get something, go back tomorrow and watch it. If online is to scale, we have to create these online videos pre-recorded. So don't look at Zoom as some sort of template. But if you can create pre-recorded, well-crafted, well-scripted, high production value online videos, then online can be a real solution to workforce education if we get our pedagogy right. And we have to think about the pedagogy next. So next slide, Bill. The good news is that a lot of the technology, online and otherwise, enables new pedagogy. We are understanding now from our study of the human brain, and I actually wrote a book about it that came out last year called GRASP, The Science Transforming How We Learn. The book documents our research into the science of learning, actually our reporting of the science of learning. There's a lot of research on it from others. For example, we know now that when you're taking a class, the ideal length of a lecture is 10 minutes, which, by the way, we've violated terribly here, but we don't have a choice. And the reason is after 10 minutes, the brain goes into a mode called mind wandering. Yeah, that's a technical term, mind wandering. It's the default mode. You can see it in a functional MRI. But it's very difficult to do a 10-minute lecture in person. But online, if you notice, if you go to edX, a lot of the lectures are 10 minutes because they can adhere to that basic cognitive scientific principle. We also know that when you learn, it should be blended because there are some aspects of learning that are best done by hand. Even programming. Programming is a team sport. You're better off doing, you can learn how to program, but software engineering is something that you're better off doing as a group. Where you test each other's code, you discuss it, discuss the architecture, and that's called blended learning. We know that projects help. If you create stuff, you learn better. So there's a whole science in the learning space. And what that science requires is a variety of delivery media. One of them is video. One of them is studios, not a lecture room, but a studio where you actually create. And then once you can put all this together, then you can create new certification programs, new content, professional mentoring, informal content. And that's how we have an opportunity. And of course, the high-tech stuff, digital credentials, AI tutors, and you can create an ecosystem for workforce education that doesn't exist today. And it's beginning to emerge. It's beginning to emerge sort of naturally along the lines that I just described. And if you go to YouTube today, if you search for 5G, some of the content there is amazing. And if you go to Google and search for workshops in 5G, you'll see a lot of these principles applied, and you can get a certificate in it, and you can put it in your resume. And there are actually already companies that will put a blockchain link to that certificate so you can't fake it. So all this ecosystem is beginning to happen. It's just disorganized. And I think we have an opportunity to organize it and do it properly. Next slide, Bill. As I've already said, all these technologies will come into play. And then if you look at the bottom half of the slide, I talk more about things like project-based learning. Apprenticeships is another space that Europe is particularly advanced in. The United States doesn't have a culture, but needs to be rekindled in Europe and the United States with a workforce education as opposed to young person education mentality. The idea that you learn machine learning at age 40 and can you do an apprenticeship with a company where you actually do work on a real project, where you learn critical thinking, troubleshooting, where you continue being assessed and coached. Next slide, Bill. So this is my last slide. So what can a university do? The way I think about it, the social contract of universities has to change. In fact, our social contract in education has to change. Our education contract today is study for 4 years and you're ready for the rest of your life. That's like saying go to a gym for 4 years and you're going to be fit for the rest of your life. You never have to go to a gym again. We know that's not true. You do have to go to the gym a few times a week. Education has to enter that social contract, change that social contract and say you have to go to the educational gym, 3 times a week or twice a week to stay abreast. Universities have to rethink how they contribute to that, and they have to look at their assets. So here we just list some, and this is more of a schematic, organizing a delivery framework or creating online platforms, actual delivery, et cetera, et cetera. And for each university is going to be different. MIT, we created edX. Why? Because that was our the first bar. And so each university has to figure out what they can do well and what they can't, and do that, and then figure out an ecosystem such that the ecosystem provides the rest of the missing pieces to make a whole package so that the workforce can have the assets it needs to remain abreast. But universities can't sit back and do what they were doing 40 years ago, because our contract has to change and we have to really examine what our role is in society. So what are the policy implications of all this? I'll hand off to Bill for that.
So as Sanjay has discussed, we need new education technologies. We've got a real problem of scale in workforce education. We've got oncoming new technologies that the existing workforce has to be educated for, and new entrants have to be educated for. New education technologies that Sanjay just described are going to be critical in this. We're going to need short courses. The semester doesn't work for incumbent workers. The kind of old harvest timetable, agricultural timetable of education, much too lengthy. It's based on seat time. We're going to have to move to systems of shorter courses, more modular education, courses that can be stacked to, create certificates in skill areas. So our community colleges in the US and education institutions all around are going to need to shift to much more focus on modular and shorter material. Our community colleges in the US, again, are a critical but underused asset. And the community colleges are not just going to take on a role of educating community college students. We're going to need them to undertake education of incumbent workers and of high school, secondary school students, so that they've got 3 tasks, not their current 1 tasks. The US is going to need to move more towards apprenticeships, or what we could call apprenticeship light. Not full apprenticeship, but giving people work experience. We have this big gap in the US. There's no system that moves you from the education world, secondary school world, into training and into work. The system just isn't built. Apprenticeships are a great way to make that connection between work and learning. But maybe they're internships, maybe they're co-ops, but some way to get that work-learn barrier down is going to be critical in the US. We're going to need to tackle our community college completion rate. In too many cases, it's only around 30% at the community college level in the US. Getting that number up significantly alone will play a huge role in improving workforce education. We're going to need to move back towards thinking about secondary schools that play a technical kind of role, that provide more kind of technical training. We abandoned that for secondary schools that are focused on college education, and then we didn't send enough people to college. We're going to have to rethink how that's going to work. There's going to be, of course, an expanded employer role. Employers provide the bulk of workforce training in the US and obviously elsewhere. And employers are going to need to move towards apprenticeship-like institutions, more training, standard settings. They're going to be critical actors and need to integrate with the other parts of the system. We're going to need new curriculum for advanced fields. Advanced manufacturing is a good example. We're going to need to move to this, and the curriculum isn't there in all too many advanced manufacturing fields yet. We're going to need underlying efforts at the state level. Even if the federal programs between the education and labor departments in the US are disconnected, the states can integrate them. They can put these pieces back together again and connect them up. And we're going to need a new labor market information system based on IT technologies. So, we have numerous recommendations in this report, this book. Just to highlight some of them, moving towards the trifecta, institutions that reach a combination of incumbent workers, secondary school students, community college students, moving towards youth apprenticeships and apprenticeship-light type programs, improving community college funding, which, by the way, the incoming president is a strong advocate of, but also turning around their completion rate. Short programs, regional joint workforce efforts that combine employers with state programs and state support with community colleges, secondary schools, and universities. Regional efforts to pull these key actors together and connect them. They're not connected now. Integrated federal programs, but operating at the state level, new labor market information systems, and, as Sanjay discussed, new education technologies to get to the scale that we're going to need. Coronavirus brought home the importance of workforce education in the US in addressing our inequality. So there's now a big test as to whether we're going to act. Thank you. Tim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Bill, Sanjay, thank you both very much. Great stuff, beautifully structured, and I know has raised a number of issues. And could I just turn to our audience for a second and just remind you, if you've got any comments or questions you'd like to make, if you can just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, it'll appear in front of us and we can then talk through those. And there's a couple coming in already, but what I just want to do first, if I may, is beautifully structured argument, clear message there. Dare I say, we know this, right? This is not a new thing. The point about new technologies available, absolutely. And I know certainly a couple of people, or several of the people in the panel, in the audience rather, would emphasize this. We've known this. We know that we need to join things up better. We know we need to be more responsive both to immediate problems and also to build a strong workforce for the future. Can I just ask you, Bill and Sanjay, to comment on why is this so difficult to do? If all the elements are known, why is it so hard to make this work?
So I can jump into that, Tim, and I'm sure Sanjay will have thoughts too. Remember that these are all legacy sectors, right? These are all established institutions. They've got their own patterns. They've got their own systems in place. Trying to bring change into a legacy system is very difficult. And while we've known a lot of this, we've had inklings of a lot of this, it's very hard to undertake this as a practical matter, to bring these actors together that have been so disconnected into a more coherent system. And then secondly, the US is unlike Europe, right? We haven't been on these issues, right? We went through a whole set of education reforms back in the 70s, 80s, where we decided college is going to be the dividing line for economic well-being. Let's bring everybody across that dividing line into college education. And we didn't do it, right? That experiment failed. I mean, the numbers went up somewhat, but not to the level that was needed. And we're just leaving too many people behind, right? So the story of the last 15 years has really been of working class disruption in the United States. It's been a story of a declining middle class and increasing economic inequality, which are just beacons, big, strong signal lights that we've got a deepening problem here, which greatly accentuates the need to try and undertake some of these reforms. And yes, we know that we need to get employers working better with educational institutions. Yeah, we've understood that for some time. We know that those programs are the best where those connections are made. But actually doing that has been a huge challenge. And frankly, in the US, we haven't been moving in that direction. We've been moving the other way, and we've been defunding those programs. So there's a critical moment here now in our context, in our US context. We're going to have to rethink the way in which we put these actors together and the way in which we connect them. But we do have, as Sanjay discussed, a whole new suite of tools that's going to be potentially available to help in this process.
I'll just add that when we look at the economy, look at, let's say, the United States, a lot of the growth's been from high-tech companies, the Teslas and Googles of the world. Our tendency is to think, oh my God, we need more higher ed. And we do. We need more PhDs. We do. And that's what's caused the cavitation. It runs, it's about lifting higher ed. It's not about the space in between high school and higher ed. That's number one. The second thing is institution building is difficult. And the third is bending institutions in that direction. That just doesn't seem as glamorous. That's my.
It's really interesting. So one of the, I think, particular things that excited us about the work you'd published was the subtitle, A New Roadmap. This idea that, as you both described, there are individual elements, some of which are new, some of which have been tried elsewhere, but it's about joining these things up. And having this roadmap approach, although used as a title, of course, is a tool that can be used to develop this. So if I can just link that to one of the questions that's come in, if I just read this out, this is from Paul Shakespeare at the High Value Manufacture Catapult. And the question is as follows: where does the balance of leadership, effort, and funding lie? State, employers, individuals, to secure the changes proposed? So this issue of who and when.
I mean, I can jump on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that all three, and that's the problem. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, and it's part of the problem with this non-system is its complexity, and different areas are going to have different kinds of solutions, and will have different mixes of leadership. We've studied a number of states and the kind of reforms that they're making in the U.S. For example, in South Carolina, there is a statewide apprenticeship program in South Carolina, and a new effort to create a youth apprenticeship program that starts in the second year of secondary school, the second year of high school in the U.S. Dramatic changes. Few other states are attempting anything like this. How did that leadership in South Carolina come up with this? Where did that happen from? Interestingly, much to my surprise, it was led by a group of smaller companies. South Carolina's got an expanding manufacturing sector with a group of large German companies, Boeing, supporting US supply chain systems. The smaller supplier companies were not getting the employers they needed and wanted in the Charleston area to do the kind of production they needed to move to. So they came to a local community college and to the local Chamber of Commerce, the local business organization, and said, help us. We're prepared to do an apprenticeship program starting in high schools. And we think that if we catch students in high school and we get them on a pathway to meaningful work in parallel to education, they'll stay loyal to us and they'll stick with us. And that proved to be the case. So these 6 companies pioneered this project. They worked with the community college on creating a curriculum around advanced manufacturing skills needed in that region. They brought in larger employers to help back the program as well. So in that case, smaller companies were the initial initiator, teaming up very quickly with a community college that kind of could administer the system, connect to the high schools as well. They got state support. So it was, again, a mix of actors, and the initiator, interestingly, in this case, started out with some smaller companies that came to the other actors and helped pull their act together. In other states, employers can be the initiators. In Kentucky, we're seeing employer-initiated programs that created a program called Kentucky Fame for real work, very impressive workforce learning effort. In Tennessee, the state has been the leader. So we're going to see different models, but all of those models end up with a combination of these different actors collaborating together.
And I guess, so one of the questions that's come in is effectively a big chunk of it is answered by those examples there, because this was our colleague Owen O'Sullivan asking for examples of initiatives where this connection has worked. But what you described there is a whole series of different examples. So how, I'll paraphrase, I'll come to Owen's question in a second, but just building on what you were saying there, how do we ensure we don't end up with lots of, dare I say it, optimal local solutions that are very hard to scale because everybody's inventing something for themselves? Or is it the fact that, no, every situation will be different and we should embrace diversity and say, no, whatever works there, that's great?
Go ahead, Bill. Sorry, please go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I sort of quipped earlier. I said the problem is all three, right? All three parties that participate, and there are three choose two sort of combinations, and three factorial sort of permutations in the way this could happen, and maybe it's four because there are other parties involved. Four factorial, right? And what you're seeing is these sort of local emergent solutions, but I just don't see them. I think they're patterns. What we need is a national program that looks at the patterns and creates 2 or 3 replicable patterns. Otherwise, I'm a little concerned that we'll end up with a lot of sort of cottage industry solutions, which are really amazing, right? But the fact of the matter is, Bill says this often. If you say to a random person on the street, what does college look like? They know what the answer is. High school, they know what the answer is. Kindergarten, they know what the answer is. Workforce education, they have no idea. And if the answer to that is 18 different case studies, that's a problem, right? So, sorry, Bill.
Sure. No, we're on the same theme here, Sanjay. Let's do a bunch of experiments and see what experiments work, analyze them, work out the metrics, and then let's settle on a group of models. The United States has decentralized education from its earliest times. The model is being decentralized to localities and to states with a very limited federal governmental role. Federal government plays a role, particularly in science education at the university and college level, and it plays a role in funding higher education student aid. Those have been the 2 kind of principal federal roles. The rest is delegated down to the states and localities. And again, this disaggregation makes the whole system that much more complicated. It would be nice if there was a czar that can hand down the education rules. But the risk there is that you're not going to have the diversity of models. You're not going to have the diversity of experiments. So how do you combine that diverse model with a coherent model? And look, what we've attempted to do is to define about 8 or 10 models that we think are workable, that could be replicated based upon experiments that have run already. So each of the models that we've seen and we highlight in the book, those have all been pretty well tested. We know those work. We know the components that go into them. And we're going to have to do a lot more of that. And then we're going to have to coalesce around the models in a disaggregated kind of system, but find forcing mechanisms that may help do this. And I think one forcing mechanism may be employers. The US has got a big change in demographics. We're going to have a declining size in our skilled workforce population. We're already upon this problem. So demand for workers is going to start increasing. And demand for skilled workers in particular is already extremely high and already a big issue for employers. I think that employer pressure is going to start to put more and more pressure on the institutions that need to get their acts together if we're going to meet those employer needs and demands.
I'll just add one more thing. I think if we can distill it to its essence, earth, water, fire, right, and wind, which we would do in the book, which is, online programs, blended elements, internships, apprenticeships, right? The 3 or 4 things. If you can systematize each of those like Legos, then the local optimization can be the way in which you assemble the Legos. But what we haven't done is systematize the elements, and that's a problem.
So much in this, and the questions that are coming in, I'm just trying to make sure I get a thread through these. You've stimulated a lot of questions. So one thing you said there, Bill, was this issue of what we need to do is to allow these different models, frameworks to arise from local conditions that are optimized locally and learn from them. So again, it comes down to this, as another role for, I'm guessing you're implying universities, to say we should be observing what's going on, capturing the data and using that to inform policy to do the next thing? Or were you suggesting something different there?
That's obviously a critical university role. Right? There's a series, as Sanjay pointed out, a series of roles in this system that nobody else is going to play that right. Universities are uniquely suited for. Now, in the US, frankly, universities and colleges, they don't think workforce education is their problem, right? They think that belongs to like the high schools, that belongs to the community colleges, that's their problem. We just do, the liberal arts and sciences. And that's a major stumbling block. So an interesting effort that Sanjay has frankly been leading at MIT is to start to get a university thinking in a very tough-minded kind of way about what is its workforce education role going to be. And we've got 11,000 students on the MIT campus. Sanjay's MicroMasters programs alone have a million enrolled students. Where's MIT, right? Which one is the MIT, right? So universities, I think, need to start, and Sanjay has just done a major report, led a major report at MIT to kind of rethink its role, and I'll turn this over to him in a second. But what are universities needed to do that other actors are not going to do? They can look at the learning science, right? No other actors are going to be looking at the learning science and trying to optimize it, particularly for online education. No other actors are going to be looking at, lifelong learning as a fully distributed system and organizing distributed systems around that. Universities are probably going to have to play that role. So there's a series of things that universities are going to do. Obviously, they'll provide, high-end kind of training piece and already doing, a fair amount of that, but they're going to need to make connection pieces too and help arrange the systems to make them work. Sanjay, let me turn it over to you because you're actually doing all this.
No, yeah, thank you, Bill. I think that we assume we know how to educate. We assume we know how learning should occur, but the science tells us many counterintuitive things. I'll throw one in here. For example, did you know that to form a memory, it is important to actually begin to forget it? Literally, when you start forgetting something, if I remind you, you will learn it better. It's called, we've known this for 120 years, by the way, and most teachers don't know it. We don't practice it. Language programs use it, like Duolingo. So in some ways, it's almost, I'm sort of reminded of, medicine before X-rays and before I got biochemistry. Duncan. It's funny what Duncan just posted on the chat. Hi, Duncan. So I think that the funny thing is that when we have an opportunity to take education and make it much more scalable, as we've done with health. And if we can get the right content, and then we get the right technology, and you do the right experiments, there is an opportunity to distill it to its essence and then just hit it out of the park. Universities run the risk of going further into the academic, ivory tower setting if they don't wake up to this. It's also an opportunity financially, if nothing else, if not socially. So.
Yeah, that's just a good reminder. The demographics of higher education do not look pretty. If you're educating a cohort that is 18 to 25 years old, you've got a problem given the demographics in the US and for that matter in other parts of the developing world, the developed world. So you're going to need to expand your financial model if you're going to survive this demographics change. So universities that start to think about lifelong learning and start to think about a broadened role in workforce education, that's going to be critical. And Sanjay and I both, are products of liberal arts education. So we're strong believers in the important university role in educating citizens. It's not as if we have to abandon that. We don't have to walk away from that. We can just do something else, right? We can walk and chew gum at the same time.
So thank you for that. There's a whole bunch of things coming in now. And as I said, I'm just trying to get a thread to connect these. So one comment and a question, as an observation really, from Eleanor Toy Scott. We're trying to rethink universities and think about the way in which they could fit into this broader system. All elements of the system need to change. And the comment that's come in is to do with, yeah, but our high school system was designed in a very different way. So our secondary education system designed, as you pointed out, Bill, for a very different past, and certainly doesn't necessarily fit the future. So at what point do we need to say each actor needs to focus on getting their bit right and really focus on that, given we don't have much time here? And if we just go, well, everything's got to change, the risk is we don't do anything. How do we know where to focus, and how much of this is it critical to go right the way from school through college, university, and beyond? If that makes sense as a question.
You want to start on that one, Sanjay, or I can?
Yeah, I mean, why? Look, our education system wasn't given to us on a tablet by God, right? We sort of made it up. It's happenstance. Why do we have 12 years of 10 plus 2? Why is it 4 years of undergrad in some countries and 3 in others? Does everyone need an undergraduate degree? I just feel that we're caught in a rut, frankly. And even if you go back 200 years, this was not the case. And Michelangelo never attended a lecture, did pretty well, right? If you look at the science of learning, if you look at the science of expertise, there's actually a beautiful book on this topic by someone by the name of Anders Ericsson, which I'll hold up. You can probably see it, called Peak. The secrets from the next science of expertise. If you look at all this, our education system should not in any way be treated as this holy thing that we cannot touch. We should have the gumption to question the entire thing, but we won't. It's because there's too much momentum there. But at least we can sort of tinker around the edges and fill these terrible gaps that have emerged that are making education systems more irrelevant and leaving society in need. And only our colleges can really fill those gaps right now. No one else is close. So I think this is going to take courage, Bill?
Yeah, it's like any complex system, right? You can't just do one thing, right? So there's a series of things that we're really going to have to undertake in parallel to drive change here. And each of the major participating institutional elements, from employers to secondary schools to universities to the American community college system, employers, the educational institutions, and the states that drive so much of education change in the US, those actors are going to have to start to plot courses. I'm involved in a project that Massachusetts is undertaking, which I think is an interesting example of what do you do? The state of Massachusetts has, a quite significant manufacturing sector still. Was affected by the declines in manufacturing in the decade of the 2000s across the US, but it's still quite a strong sector. And there's a lot of advanced technology elements in that. It's one of the pillars of the state economy. The governor, decided that we're going to have to support our key pillars. Manufacturing is one of 3. He decided, even though the education departments and the labor departments at the federal level in the US don't talk to each other, he was going to have a skills cabinet in Massachusetts. And he was going to bring in the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Labor, and the Economic Development Organization in the state. And then we're going to be a combined skills cabinet to start to upskill the workforce to get to the kinds of skills that were going to be needed in the high-end healthcare research and production system, in a high-end advanced manufacturing system, in a high-end IT system. That the skills cabinet was, none of those organizations was going to be able to make a decision about workforce education unless the other 2 agreed. So he created, in effect, a troika kind of system where each could cancel out the others, force them in a way to collaborate. Those secretaries now meet every other week, and their deputies meet every week on common approaches on workforce education. That's not a bad model. In turn, the state managed to get some federal funding to undertake across all of its educational institutions, its secondary schools, as well as its community colleges, and including some of the state universities, to develop a whole system across the state for advanced manufacturing education. Let's develop that curriculum in common. Let's develop the delivery systems for that new curriculum in common. Let's figure out what the certificates are going to be. Let's start to modularize those pieces and create modular elements around advanced manufacturing that can be stacked into new credentials and as well as degrees. That planning effort is now going on across the state. It's got federal support, and the federal agencies hope that it's going to work, and that in turn the feds may be able to fund other kind of statewide efforts in a comparable kind of way. So that's an example of a region attempting to pull its act together in a fairly systematic and kind of organized way.
Excellent. That's really helpful. And I think that addresses one of these issues about how do we have the open channels of communication, the signaling between the different actors to allow understanding to be maintained as things change, and resources to be deployed as they're needed in that context. So unfortunately, each of the answers you give seems to be triggering further questions, which is wonderful. So one here from Thomas Gunther about this, okay, this is a UK context, and it's this question about motivation to change. So there's that tension, perhaps just speaking from a UK university's context, to sort of to standardize and say, this is what you need to do. This is about accreditation to do these standard things and to do them well, so you know exactly what you've got when you've gone somewhere and it's transferable elsewhere. Could perhaps at times be considered a bit of a constraint on innovation. So again, any comments about how a university seeks to ensure that it's doing something that is the right thing, it is fair, you're getting what you thought you're getting, as well as allowing experimentation to take place? I don't know. Sanjay, do you want to kick off with that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have, I'm going to be provocative, as I always am, I suppose. But there is this story that our education system derives from factories. And there's some truth to it. It's not completely true, but there is some truth to it. And what are factories about? It's about making parts. And what do you do with the part for quality control? You do testing. So universities are very testing oriented. What was the crowning glory of the Industrial Revolution? It was interchangeable parts. Well, our educational system is all about interchangeable people. So highly tested, interchangeable people, clones of each other. Automatons. And now we worry about automatons taking our jobs. Well, damn it, we just trained automatons, right? And it's sort of a strange thing. So on the one hand, I believe in standardization because we need to make sure that people know what they know. But on the other hand, there is something about the emergent beauty and brilliance of people that we have to give opportunity to. And let's face it, the economy is changing also in a different way, which is the gig economy, right? People who work for themselves, so they become the CEOs of their own lives, the chief learning officers, the chief technical officers, the chief marketing officer, the chief financial officer of their own lives. They have to craft their own paths in a freelancing environment where that degree doesn't matter past your second or third gig. What matters is your reference from the past gig. And you have to look at the next gig and say, I need to learn some skills. I need to learn Instagram marketing or whatever the latest new thing is, and take an online course, become an expert on it, go do something, get some references, and then change. And then a couple of years later, you're going to change again. So I think the problem is we conflate standardization with a sort of a monolithic approach. And what I would suggest is what we need is a highly granular standardization. And with that, we can have our cake and eat it too. I'm mixing my metaphors here, but the point is that individuals can sort of mass customize their education. So if you take a course on digital marketing, if you took it in 2017, this is what you got. And you can prove you got that. But it is not a one-year commitment. It's a small commitment. You got it. It's a micro achievement. You can put it on your resume. And then you craft a different path. The problem with our standardization today is it's monolithic and it's big. I think we can sort of make it granular and have the emergent sort of opportunities that humans seek in this new environment. So that's where I would go with that.
And I'll just give a couple of examples, I think, of that concept that Sanjay is pushing. How do you get enough standardization so that you reach a common level of quality, right? That's going to be a big challenge in any education effort, right? You want to set standards so that you assure students, assure employers that there's a certain level of quality and that they understand what knowledge has been imparted, what skills are available. And obviously you need to credentialize that as well so that there's recognized employer accepted credentials behind those things. We've seen some examples in the US of systems that are attempting to do this. So for example, in Indiana, there is only one community college. It happens to have, over 20 branches. It's called ID Tech. And the whole state is in effect one community college with many campuses. And they have an effort that brings those schools together to with employers to keep advancing their curriculum so that it's relevant to the skill sets that employers need. So they've got a statewide process to assure that. But just to allow that innovation piece, this granularity that Sanjay is talking about, they also allow their different community college campuses to innovate with regional employers that may have particular needs and particular demands and develop their own materials. So, 70% may be fairly uniform, and that so that employers know what they're getting when a degree comes out of the Indiana Ivy Tech community college system. But there's also enough variety in there to allow innovation, to allow particular campuses to experiment. And then they in turn have a way of bringing those new ideas back to the whole to keep the whole system innovating. The state of Ohio, like most states, has independent community colleges, and that's most of US higher education. Heaven forbid that universities would ever talk to each other about what they're doing. Doesn't happen very much. And the same story at most community colleges. They don't trade ideas. There's no system in place for that kind of collaboration. The state of Ohio has created a TechNet so that all of its community college leaders in the manufacturing field come together on like an every 2-week basis and trade ideas and thinking and trade the modules they're putting together so that they can form course elements in other courses around the state. That kind of cooperation, as well as combination, as well as being combined with experimentation, I think is what we're going to need a lot more of.
So, thanks both. So this theme of qualifications, credentials linked to innovation and standardization that's coming through quite strongly. As I'm just keeping one eye on the clock here, there's one other clump of questions I'd like to come to in a second. But before we do that, Sanjay, do you want to just give a voiceover for the response you've given to David Sainsbury's question about if a national system of qualifications is so important and governments struggle to do this sometimes, why don't the leading universities do it? Do you want to just comment on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, universities guard their qualifications very carefully because that's all we have, really. And so we have at MIT certainly taken a step beyond. The MicroMasters is one. We're working on other micro credentials. The fact that we can credentialize and then prove them on a blockchain is sort of another step in that direction. But then it's hard, right? Even for MIT. I mean, the MicroMasters took off, as I said, they're in 5 continents now. But then employers have to accept them, and that's happened too. But I can tell you, it's taken 5 years out of my life, right? And that's sitting at MIT. I think we need a much more systematized approach. We need the leaders of countries calling companies CEOs and saying, "Listen, how do we craft this? We need legislatures, we need accreditation agencies waking up to this." But there's so many players; it's hard for an entity, even a big entity, to pull it off.
That's great. Thank you for that. So the other, I guess, group of questions relates to this issue about innovation, as in the signaling issue that has been discussed up until now. One version of signaling is employers saying, these are the skills we need. But how do you deal with the new things that are coming along that employers may not yet know they need, and yet without them in the future, we're going to be back exactly where we are now with a different set of problems? Any comments on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a gigantic issue, and we're confronting it in advanced manufacturing in particular. So we have a glimpse of an idea of what the skill sets are that are going to be needed for things like additive manufacturing, for robotics, for aspects of digital production. Those are emerging. Those are starting to enter factory floors. We're starting to build education materials around those. But then there's a whole suite of other advanced manufacturing fields, right? Photonics, certain kinds of advanced materials and composites, power electronics, high-end optics, right? Those are going to be entering manufacturing, but they are further out. And how do we start to account for those systems? What we're seeing in our advanced manufacturing institutes is that they are developing skill roadmaps. They're developing technology roadmaps, and that indicate what technology thresholds they need to get to the next stages of, say, photonics and high-end optics. But in parallel that, they're developing skills roadmaps, making an assessment of what demand and supply looks like in different regions and different skill areas, and then trying to figure out how an education system is going to be able to kind of meet the needs of these oncoming fields. Often these fields exist to a certain scale, and then they're going to have to advance significantly beyond that. So fortunately, there may be an existing workforce base you can build on, as in the case of photonics, albeit small. Mainly, it may be particularly an engineering workforce base with only gradual increase in a technician workforce base. Each one of these technology areas are going to be different, but this technique of developing a skills roadmap in parallel that meets up with the technology roadmap, I think is a technique that can help us kind of meet these problems. And those roadmaps require bringing the different actors, the usual set of actors, the educational institutions, the states, and the employers together to participate in that road mapping activity.
Sanjay, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, look, if I have to drive to Boston today, I'm going to look at Waze, I'm going to look at the weather, I'm going to, I have a sense of where the traffic's going to be and where not to go. I'm in, a town near Boston right now. Our students don't know. I mean, if they study nursing, do they know which technology is going to be in demand? Is there a system that crawls the job sites or looks at roadmaps as Bill described? We need an information system that gives both the employees and the employers some certainty. It's in both their interests, but we don't have even a facility for that today, right? And the places like MIT, the advantage is our students get to see that because we're on the cutting edge. But a lot of students will ask, I run to students all the time, they ask questions and I go, oh my God, you poor thing. I mean, no one told you that no one does technical drawing by hand anymore, right? I'm not, literally, that's a conversation I had about 2 years ago. So I think that we need to build these information systems as well. And it can be done. And there's a lot of research on it using systems like ONET, which is this system in the United States.
So there's something really interesting coming out around this issue of signaling and mapping. It seems really intriguing, where you can go, as you said, Bill, we have technology roadmaps and you can develop in parallel skills roadmaps. But I guess the key thing is that they are integrated, that at any point, as the technology develops and new things are discovered, that will modify what's in the skills roadmap. And then, as you were saying, Sanjay, the ability to kind of have this fast feedback as these things are used and developed, that changes things as well. And that's going to be happening at an ever increasing speed. But I hate to bring it back to the same question again, which is ownership of those, the coordination function between these activities, because couldn't you see a world where you end up with lots of beautiful maps and plans all being developed all over the place, but they're not linked to the implementation of policy? Because people go, well, that's great. How does that? So how do we ensure that all these great ideas, dare I say it, do get integrated and deployed, and fully accept that there are bits that are missing at the moment? But even if we do get all these bits together, how do we ensure it leads to effective policy?
Let me describe something that we've been watching in the advanced manufacturing space since this is IFM after all. And hopefully this will get back to some of Lord Sainsbury's question too, which I'm not sure we fully responded to. The advanced manufacturing institutes thought their job was technology development, right? They thought that was what they were supposed to do in their particular technology area. But then they realized that unless there was a skilled workforce, both at the higher end engineering side as well as the technical workforce, unless those were developed in parallel, nobody was ever going to do advanced manufacturing. So you had to have an effort in place that paralleled your technology development side. And in turn, this technique of developing roadmaps on both sides that talk to each other, right? The skills and the technology roadmaps. It's not a bad technique to apply to those. And that's a job that these advanced manufacturing institutes are taking on. And then their workforce education programs, in the best cases anyway, can be both online for scaling, which is particularly useful for fields that are only just starting up, right? A community college can't fill its seats teaching about photonics, but you can, meet the need through online education. So the Photonics Institute, for example, in the US has done a lot of work on developing online materials, both at the engineering and the technician side. It's got a whole suite of course materials now online and available there. And that in turn, came out of its road mapping. How are we going to get the institutions to come aboard? We're not at the scale to do that. What's the alternative way to approach this? So there's a double problem here. We've talked a lot today about the whole content delivery problem, but obviously in parallel to that, there's a profound content development process. And yet it's got to incorporate the same actors, and it's got to go one step further because the next generation stuff isn't necessarily being taught or being used by employers who could dictate what the credentials might be. So you've got to do this road mapping exercise that constantly puts you out ahead. Another job, and this gets to Lord Sainsbury's question, another job of the manufacturing institutes is now and is starting to be developing credentialing systems in these new fields. The institutes themselves are collaborations between employers and states and the federal government and educational institutions, right? They are this right combined mix. It's not easy to administer these things. It would be better if there was one PI that got a single grant. Instead, you've got 100 different actors involved in these manufacturing institutes. It's a very complex kind of model to administer, but we're kind of feeling our way in the successful ones towards how to do that, to how to bring these kind of consortia efforts together. And then could the institutes in turn come up with that credentialing system, right, for their new technologies, working with the employers and their road mapping activities to envision what are the skill sets that are actually being needed and roughly at what kind of stage and at what kind of volume to meet what kind of demand. So we're starting to see some of that occurring in these new areas of credentialing we're going to have. Now, other credentialing in the United States is pretty chaotic. We've got hundreds of credentialing systems that are operating in the manufacturing field and very limited coherence between them. So they tend to be regional. Some regional employers will go for this kind of credential as opposed to a NIMS credential or opposed to a NOCTI credential or a SOCA credential. There's different credentialing systems that are accepted in different regions and amongst different employers. Creating coherence out of that is another deep, challenging problem. But trying to get our education system, which is embarking on this, to offer not simply degrees and certificates, but embedded within those degrees and certificates, industry accepted credentials, right? And then a system to develop the next generation of credentials for the next round of technologies. All three of those pieces are going to have to be in place.
Super. Sanjay, did you want to comment on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think of our role in academic institutions. We're sort of part of the supply chain of talent. The problem is the packages have no to address, right? And no way of finding out where they're heading. And our curricula are not, again, MIT is different, Cambridge is different, but most universities, what is the curriculum based on? What demand? Now, of course, it's not all about trying to get students a job. You're also preparing them for life. I get that, that's great. But what aspect of what you teach is informed by what industry wants? And this is actually the study that Bill and I triggered, because we had all this online content and we're trying to figure out what we were trying to do it for. And this is, to me, this whole is something that this is an existential gap. And I think the countries that figure it out will have an advantage. The countries that don't will have a disadvantage. And the balance is going to be figuring it out and making it a guideline, but not enforcing it so that you don't kill the creativity, the wonderful emergent properties that can emerge from our educational systems.
So thank you. I'm conscious that time is against us, but you can clearly it was well worthwhile organizing this event, judging by the level of questions that are coming through. Just to reassure people, I know we haven't got to all of your questions. We will be saving them all and doing our best to respond to them offline. I'm sort of making that offer on behalf of Sanjay and Bill, but if nothing else, I'm sure that something is sent back to you. But I would like to just draw things to a close, if I may, by first, though, asking Sanjay and then Bill for any closing comments you might wish to make, anything you feel hasn't been covered yet, or any points you want to emphasize. Sanjay.
I actually will repeat what I said, which is rethink learning. The way we teach is not necessarily the right way to do it. The technologies and the science of learning can transform our effectiveness, just as medicine has transformed health, number one. And number two, rethink purpose and fill in the gaps. Institutions have to reach outside their comfort zones and fill in the gaps, because the gaps are basically the story that will define our economic futures. So, Bill?
I think I'd just like to emphasize how important this task is. The American dream and the dream of democracies in general, it was a promise that, if you worked hard, you can move up, you can get into, well-paying working class jobs that provide a gateway into an ever-growing kind of middle class. But today we've got increasing economic inequality, not economic convergence. And technological advances are ongoing. And unless you get those skill sets, you're kind of out of the system. And we're just leaving too many people behind in the US. That's a major causative factor for the political disruption that the US has been suffering in recent years. So, the importance of tackling this workforce education, this is a set of policies that's in range. This is a set of policies that the political system could agree on. There's not much battling over the need for better workforce education in the US. We could do it. We just have to arrive at the different formulas, the different models that we want to push and pressure and provide experimentation of those models and then start developing a system to settle on them.
Great, thank you for those closing comments. And I guess one of the issues at the start, as you were positioning this as a US perspective on these things, perhaps some of the panelists may have thought, well, that's interesting, that's a different situation to what we're facing here. But exactly what you've described, particularly at the state level, it's exactly the same. We're dealing with entities of a very similar scale. And there was a query in from one of our colleagues from Innovate UK on that very issue. So there's a few other things that I'll come back to, perhaps offline with you both, if I may, and then maybe circulate these to the attendees. But I think it's just really, really interesting and timely. And this issue of what we're facing at the moment, we were facing anyway. We're facing very similar problems. And now because of COVID, it is just so critical we get this right, because I think a fear of a lot of us is we could just try and bodge it through, just sort of make it work for a little bit longer. But what I'm hearing from today and from reading your book and then hearing you discuss this is these are big changes that have to happen, but they're not so big that we just can't deal with them. Yes, the system needs to change, but there are lots of specific ways we can interact with that system to enhance it. And I guess picking up three bits, there's the system view on it, the signaling issues, the coordination issues, and then very clearly all the way through this going, but the way we've been doing it up until now can change. It's okay. We have that freedom as educational institutions. We really do have that freedom. So notwithstanding that comment about standardization and your great analogy there with the factory, Sanjay, but it's also true, we can innovate, we can do this, but it's up to us to do it. And there's so much more we could dig into there. I wish we could just carry on with this, but I must draw this to a close. So first of all, Bill and Sanjay, thank you both very much for presenting this so clearly and for discussing so openly. To all our panelists for great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to answer all of them. We'll follow up as best we can afterwards. To Lisa and Louise for organizing all of this. And to Owen O'Sullivan, who kickstarted all this by saying, hey, this is a good book. You should get Sanjay and Bill to come and give a talk. So Owen, thank you very much for doing that. On that note, I shall then say a good morning and a good afternoon and good evening to all of you, and thank you very much and stay safe. Bye for now.